Chosen one, listen carefully. They paid a judge real money, wired straight from an account they thought could never be traced, just to make sure you spent the rest of your life behind bars for something you never touched. That was the plan. Ruin you, silence you, and let the system do the dirty work so nobody's hands looked stained. And right now, while you're watching this, that same judge isn't sitting on a bench anymore. He's sitting in a cell, in an orange jumpsuit instead of a black robe, 3 doors down from the exact people who paid him. Let that land for a second. They thought a courtroom was the safest place to bury you. No witnesses to argue with, no crowd to convince, just paperwork, a gavel, and a man in a black robe who'd already been paid to make sure the outcome was decided before you ever walked in. They didn't need to win an argument, they just needed to buy one. And they were so confident, so sure, that nobody checks a judge, that nobody questions a verdict once it's signed, that nobody with real power would ever look twice at a case that small. They were wrong. Somebody was already looking. Not a lawyer scrambling for a loophole, not a reporter chasing a headline. Somebody with actual reach, actual weight, the kind of person who doesn't need to raise their voice, because when they move, things simply stop happening the way they were supposed to happen. Somebody who saw the case number, saw the names attached to it, and felt something that didn't sit right. And once that kind of person starts pulling a thread, chosen one, the whole coat comes apart. You didn't hire an army of lawyers. You didn't have a campaign or a hashtag or a crowd outside the courthouse. What you had was the truth, sitting quietly in a file nobody had opened yet, waiting for the one person with the power to open it. And they found it. They found the wire transfer. They found the phone records. They found the private meeting that was never supposed to exist on paper, but did, because people who think they're untouchable always get sloppy in exactly the place they think nobody's watching. So here's where we are now, chosen one. The people who tried to buy your freedom got a receipt they didn't ask for. The judge who took their money is no longer wearing a robe. He's wearing a number. And the case that was supposed to end with your name in a file marked guilty is now the case that's ending their entire story instead. Before we go further into exactly how this fell apart for them, hit that like button and subscribe. Chosen one. Not for me, for the mission. Every share, every like, it's what pushes this message to the next person sitting exactly where you were sitting a few months ago, wondering if the system would ever see them clearly. This isn't just a video, it's a signal. And the more of us who send it out, the harder it becomes for people like this to keep buying outcomes in the dark. Now let's keep going, because this story doesn't start with the arrest. It starts long before that, in a room you were never invited into, where a decision was made about your life like you were a line item in somebody's budget. They didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy you out of nowhere. This was planned, slow, patient, the kind of plan that takes months to build because people who are careful about crime are also careful about covering it. They picked their target, they picked their charges, and then they went shopping for a judge, the same way you'd shop for anything else you intend to control. They needed someone with debts, someone with a taste for money they weren't supposed to have, someone whose signature could be bought as easily as a used car. And they found him. For weeks you didn't know any of this was happening. You went to work, you paid your bills, you lived your life the way innocent people do, without the paranoia of someone who actually has something to hide. Meanwhile, somewhere in an office you never saw, an envelope changed hands. A number was agreed on, and a verdict was written before a single piece of evidence had even been presented. That's how confident they were. That's how little they thought your life was worth. But confidence built on a bribe is a fragile thing, chosen one, because it only works as long as nobody with real power ever looks in that direction. And somebody did. If you feel that shift happening in your own chest right now, drop a 77 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And if this story is hitting somewhere real for you, consider dropping a super thanks. It keeps this mission running, it keeps these truths coming, and every bit helps us reach the next person who needs to hear that the system, even when it's rigged, can still be turned inside out. Now let's break this whole thing down, piece by piece, starting with the moment they decided your freedom had a price tag. Because here's what you need to understand before we go any further, chosen one. This wasn't a mistake the system made on its own. Systems don't bribe themselves. People do that. Real people, sitting in real rooms, making a real decision to trade someone else's freedom for their own comfort. And every single one of those people believed, right up until the moment it fell apart, that they were smarter than the truth, that they could outmaneuver something that has never once, in the entire history of anyone trying, actually stayed buried forever. They looked at you and saw someone easy to move against. No powerful family name behind you, no expensive legal team on retainer, no obvious protection standing between you and whatever they decided to throw at you. That's exactly why they chose you, chosen one. Not because you did anything wrong. Because you looked, on paper, like someone who couldn't fight back. What they never accounted for is that being underestimated and being unprotected are two completely different things, and the gap between those two things was about to become the exact space where their entire plan collapsed. Number one, the envelope that was supposed to erase you. It didn't start with handcuffs. It started with a number written on a sticky note in a room with the blinds closed. That's how cheap they thought your life was, chosen one. Not priceless, not complicated, just a figure, a transaction, a line item they could afford if it meant you disappeared from their problem list for good. They sat there and negotiated your future like it was a used car with a scratch on the hood, talking price instead of talking truth, because truth was never part of their plan to begin with. They told themselves it was simple. Pay the man in the robe, let the paperwork do what paperwork does, and walk away clean while you sat in a cell, wondering how a system built on evidence ever found you guilty of something you never did. They weren't worried about proof. Proof was never the point. The point was the signature at the bottom of the page, and signatures, they believed, could be bought like anything else in this world if you knew who to ask and how much to offer. Picture it like this. A man sits behind a desk that isn't his, in a courtroom that's supposed to belong to the truth, and he takes an envelope thick enough to buy a stranger's whole future. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't hesitate. He slides it into a drawer like it's nothing, like your life is nothing, like the oath he swore the day he put on that robe was just a costume he wears for people who still believe in it. That's what they were counting on. A judge who forgot what the robe meant the moment the money hit the table. A system that only works if every person inside it still believes in it, and one corrupted piece was all it took, in their minds, to make the whole machine work against you instead of for you. Here's what they didn't calculate. Money changes hands quietly, but it never changes hands invisibly. Every transfer leaves a shadow. Every meeting leaves a memory in somebody's head, even if it never makes it onto paper. Every bribe is a debt that gets written down somewhere, in a bank record, in a phone log, in the trembling hands of somebody involved who eventually can't sleep at night anymore. They thought the envelope was the end of the story. It was actually the first page of the file that would end them. You might wonder why they were so bold, so certain nothing would ever come back to bite them. Because in their world, this had worked before. They'd bought silence before. They'd bought outcomes before. Nobody had ever pulled the thread far enough to unravel it. But this time, chosen one, somebody did pull the thread, and it turns out the whole sweater they built their reputation on was held together by nothing but the assumption that nobody powerful enough would ever care to look. They were wrong about that assumption, And that single miscalculation is the reason this story ends with them in a cell instead of you. You might ask why an envelope from months ago even matters now, why we're starting there instead of jumping straight to the part where they get caught. Because every downfall has an origin point, chosen one, and theirs was the exact moment they decided your life could be purchased. That decision was the crack in the foundation. Everything that followed, the fake case, the bought verdict, the arrest that never should have happened, all of it grew out of that one arrogant assumption that money could quiet a truth that was never actually theirs to silence. Number 2, why they went shopping for a judge like they were shopping for a weapon. Choosing the right judge wasn't random, chosen one. It was strategy, cold and deliberate, the kind of planning that tells you exactly how far someone is willing to go when they've decided you're a problem worth spending real money on. They didn't pick a courtroom by accident. They studied it. They researched which judges had debts nobody else knew about, which ones had a history of rulings that quietly bent whichever direction the money pointed, which ones had reputations soft enough in the right circles to be approached without too much risk. They found their man, a judge with a taste for a lifestyle his salary could never actually support. A judge with old debts stacking up behind a smile nobody thought to question. A judge whose ambition had quietly curdled into something willing to trade principle for comfort. To everyone else in that courthouse, he looked respectable, robed, dignified, a pillar holding up a system people trust with their whole lives. To the people trying to bury you, he looked like exactly what he was, an opportunity. Imagine a locksmith who knows exactly which locks in the whole city can be picked without setting off an alarm. That's what they were doing when they chose him. They weren't hoping the system would fail you by accident. They were engineering the failure on purpose, targeting the one weak point in an entire structure built to protect people like you, and betting that one weak point was enough to bring the whole thing down around your head. But here's what they never understood about weak points. Chosen one. The very thing that makes someone corruptible also makes them careless. A person who can be bought once can usually be bought twice, and a person who can be bought twice leaves twice as many fingerprints. They picked their judge because he was flexible. They never stopped to ask themselves what flexible actually meant for their own exposure. You might be asking yourself right now why any of this matters, why the backstory of a corrupt selection process even changes anything for you sitting where you're sitting. It matters because every choice they made to protect themselves ended up being the exact choice that exposed them. The judge they picked because he was easy to buy turned out to be easy to catch. The system they thought they'd cracked from the inside was never as broken as they believed, because somewhere above the corruption they built, somebody with real power was still watching the whole board and watching for exactly this kind of quiet decay. Ask yourself why this detail even matters, chosen one. Because it tells you exactly who you were up against. Not a system that failed you randomly, but a small group of people who put real time, real research, and real money into finding the one crack they thought they could exploit. That level of planning should terrify you a little. It should also comfort you, because people who plan that carefully around a weakness always overestimate how well hidden that weakness actually is. They thought they'd found a blind spot in the system. They'd actually just found the one spot somebody powerful was already keeping an eye on. Number 3, the charges built on absolutely nothing. Let's be honest about what they actually had against you, chosen one. Nothing. Not evidence, not motive, not a shred of anything that would hold up under real scrutiny. What they had was a story, carefully constructed, professionally worded, dressed up to look like a case, when really it was fiction with a filing number attached. They didn't need the truth to be on their side. They needed the paperwork to look convincing enough that nobody would bother checking twice. They built it piece by piece, the way you'd build a stage set for a play that only needs to survive one performance. A statement here, slightly exaggerated. A timeline there, quietly rearranged. A document that technically existed, but had been edited just enough to point in the direction they needed it to point. None of it was true. All of it was designed to look true to anyone who didn't dig deeper than the surface. Picture a house built entirely out of cardboard, painted to look like brick from a distance. From the street it looks solid, permanent, impossible to knock down. Get close enough, touch it, lean on it even slightly, and the whole structure buckles because there was never anything real holding it up. That's what their case against you actually was. Convincing from a distance, collapsible under any real pressure. They counted on nobody applying that pressure. They counted on you being alone, unrepresented in any way that mattered, too exhausted and too overwhelmed to fight a system that already had a judge in its pocket before you even walked through the courthouse doors. That's the part that should make your blood boil, chosen one. They didn't just build a lie. They built a lie specifically designed to work only because they assumed nobody would care enough to check it. Somebody cared enough to check it. You might wonder how a case with nothing real behind it ever made it as far as it did. Because paper doesn't argue back, and judges who've already been paid don't ask the questions they're supposed to ask. The system depends on every piece doing its job honestly, and the moment even one piece decides honesty is optional, a house of cardboard can stand long enough to fool a room full of people who trusted it. But cardboard only survives as long as nobody with real strength leans on it. And chosen one, somebody with real strength, was about to lean very, very hard. Think about how many people must have read that file and simply believed it, chosen one. Clerks, assistants, maybe even people who should have questioned it and didn't, because questioning it wasn't their job or wasn't worth the risk to their own paycheck. That's how a lie like this survives as long as it does. Not because it's convincing on its own merit, but because enough people in the chain choose comfort over scrutiny. It takes exactly one person willing to break that chain to bring the whole fiction down. And chosen one, that person was already circling closer than anyone realized. Number 4. The watcher nobody knew was in the room. Here's the part they never saw coming. While they were busy congratulating themselves on how clean their plan looked, somebody with actual influence had already noticed something was wrong. Not because you asked for help, not because you had the connections to reach that kind of person, because that's what real power does when it's paying attention, chosen one. It doesn't wait for an invitation. It notices patterns other people miss, and it moves before anyone even realizes it's watching. This person wasn't sitting in the courtroom. They didn't need to be. Their reach extended into rooms you never even knew existed, into records most people don't have access to, into conversations happening behind closed doors that were supposed to stay sealed forever. They saw the timeline of your case and noticed it moved too fast, too clean, too convenient. They saw the judge's name and remembered whispers they'd heard before, small rumors nobody had ever bothered to chase down. And once those two things lined up in their mind, they stopped ignoring it. Imagine a hawk circling high above a field, invisible to everything moving below it, patient, silent, missing nothing. That's the kind of attention that landed on your case. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise, and utterly impossible to hide from once it locked onto its target. They started quietly, a phone call here, a records request there, a conversation with someone who owed them a favor from years ago. Nothing flashy, nothing that would tip off the people trying to bury you, just a slow, methodical unraveling of a plan that was never built to survive real scrutiny. Every step they took was another crack forming in a wall your enemies believed was solid. You didn't know any of this was happening, chosen one. You were still sitting there, wondering how a fair system could turn against someone who did nothing wrong. Meanwhile, somewhere far outside your line of sight, someone with the power to actually change your outcome had already decided your story wasn't going to end the way they intended it to. That's the part your enemies still don't fully understand. They thought they were the only ones with reach. They had no idea somebody with more reach had already started walking straight toward them. You might wonder why someone with that kind of power would even bother with a case as small as yours, chosen one, when they could have spent that attention anywhere else. Here's the truth. People with real influence usually got there by noticing exactly the things everyone else overlooks. A small, quiet injustice tells them more about a broken system than a loud, obvious one ever could. Your case wasn't small to them. It was a signal, a symptom of exactly the kind of decay that, left unchecked, spreads far beyond one courtroom and one bribed judge. Number 5. The night the trail got found. Every corrupt plan leaves a trail, chosen one, and theirs was no exception. It happened on an ordinary night, nothing dramatic, no flashing lights, no dramatic reveal. Just someone sitting with a stack of financial records, cross-referencing dates, matching numbers against a timeline that had been bothering them for weeks. And then, there it was, a wire transfer, small enough to almost miss, timed exactly 2 days before a critical ruling in your case. That's how these things fall apart, chosen one. Not in one dramatic moment, but in the quiet click of 2 facts finally lining up in front of someone smart enough to notice. The transfer alone wasn't proof of everything, but it was proof of something, and something is all it takes to justify pulling harder on the thread. From that one transfer came a second one. From the second came a pattern. From the pattern came a name attached to an account that had no business being anywhere near a sitting judge's finances. Picture a detective standing in a room full of scattered photographs, connecting them one string at a time until a face emerges from what used to look like chaos. That's exactly what was happening that night. Except the detective wasn't hunting for a killer. They were hunting for the truth that was going to set you free and bury the people who thought they'd erased you for good. Once the money trail was confirmed, everything else came faster. Phone records that placed the judge in the same city as your accusers on days he had no official reason to be there. A calendar entry, vague on purpose, that lined up perfectly with the timeline of the bribe. Small pieces, individually meaningless, together undeniable. You weren't in that room, chosen one. You had no idea any of this was happening while you sat somewhere else, carrying weight you never should have had to carry. But that night, the tide turned without you lifting a single finger. Somebody found the trail. And once a trail like that gets found by the right person, there is no version of the story where it stays buried. Somewhere around that same time, chosen one, the people who orchestrated all of this were still sleeping easy, still confident, still telling each other the plan had worked exactly as intended. That's the part that makes this moment so satisfying to look back on. While they were celebrating quietly behind closed doors, somebody was sitting a few miles away with a folder growing thicker by the hour, building the exact case that would eventually end their celebration for good. They had no idea the clock had already started. Nobody ever does, right up until it runs out. Number 6. Why your calm in that courtroom confused everyone. Here's something that probably didn't make sense to you at the time. Chosen one. Why didn't you fall apart? Everyone expected you to. Your accusers expected panic, tears, some kind of collapse they could point to as proof of guilt. Instead, you sat there steady, quiet, present in a way that unsettled people who wanted you to look exactly like someone with something to hide. That calm wasn't weakness. It was the truth, holding you upright when everything around you was built on lies. People who are actually guilty perform. They over-explain. They fill silence with justifications nobody asked for. because guilt needs noise to survive. You didn't do any of that. You sat with the accusation the way someone sits with something that simply isn't true, without the frantic energy of someone trying to convince a room of something they know deep down isn't real. That difference is subtle, but people in that room felt it, even the ones who wouldn't admit it out loud. Imagine a river that's been dammed by something that was never meant to hold back that much water. It doesn't matter how solid the dam looks on the surface. Pressure finds cracks eventually, and pressure always wins in the end. Your calm was the water. Their fabricated case was the dam. And every day you sat there steady instead of breaking, you were quietly proving that what they built could never actually hold. Your accusers noticed. It unsettled them more than they ever admitted. They needed you to look guilty because their entire plan depended on the appearance of guilt covering for the absence of actual evidence. Every time you refused to give them that performance, you made their fabricated case look thinner, even before anyone found a single piece of proof against the judge. You weren't performing innocence, chosen one. You were simply living inside the truth, and the truth doesn't need theatrics to hold its shape. That steadiness is exactly what made the eventual collapse of their plan feel so complete, because the contrast between your calm and their unraveling told its own story before a single headline ever did. There's a reason people who are actually innocent tend to move differently through a courtroom, chosen one, even when they don't consciously know they're doing it. They don't have a script to manage. They don't have contradictions to keep straight. They just have the truth, which never needs rehearsing because it doesn't change no matter how many times you tell it. Your accusers had a story that needed constant maintenance. You had a truth that simply held its shape. That contrast was visible to anyone paying close enough attention, and somebody was paying very close attention indeed. Number 7. The wire transfer they thought was invisible. They genuinely believed money could move without leaving a trace. Chosen one, as long as it moved through the right channels, the right accounts, the right shell company set up specifically to blur the line between a bribe and a business transaction. They thought they'd built something clean, untraceable, protected by enough layers that nobody would ever bother peeling them all back. They were wrong, and not because the layers weren't clever. They were wrong because clever only works until somebody with the resources and the motivation to look decides it's worth the time. Once the investigation started pulling on that first transfer, the shell company they thought was a shield turned into a map instead, leading straight from the account that funded the bribe to the account that received it, with a paper trail so precise it read almost like a confession. Picture water finding every hairline crack in a foundation nobody thought to check. That's what a real investigation does to money that was never actually clean. No amount of shell companies or middlemen changes what the transfer actually was. It only adds more names to the list of people who eventually have to explain themselves. And explain themselves they did, chosen one, though not by choice. Once investigators had the transfer, they had dates. Once they had dates, they had a timeline. And once they had a timeline that matched perfectly with critical decisions made in your case, there was no explanation left that didn't point directly at exactly what happened. Money for a verdict. A price on your freedom, paid in installments that were supposed to disappear into layers of paperwork designed to protect exactly no one once someone competent started looking. They thought invisible meant untraceable. It never does. Every transfer is a whisper, and whispers carry further than people who make them ever expect. This one carried all the way to the person whose attention was about to end everything they'd built against you. Here's what should really sit with you, chosen one. They had every opportunity to walk away before any of this started. Nobody forced their hand. Nobody made the decision for them to move money through a shell company built specifically to hide a bribe. That was a choice, made deliberately. made with full knowledge of what it meant if it was ever discovered. And every choice like that leaves a signature behind, whether the person making it wants to admit it or not. Theirs was written in numbers instead of ink, but it was every bit as damning once somebody finally read it correctly. Number 8. The witness who flipped at the worst possible time for them. Every corrupt plan has a weak link, chosen one, and theirs was a person close enough to see everything, but never quite trusted with enough loyalty to stay silent forever. Somebody who'd been in the room for at least part of the arrangement. Somebody who knew more than they ever should have known, and who eventually realized the weight of what they were carrying was heavier than any amount of money could make bearable. It wasn't guilt that broke them at first. It was fear, the realization that once an investigation starts pulling threads, everyone attached to that thread becomes a target too. And people who were only ever loosely loyal to a conspiracy tend to protect themselves the moment protecting the conspiracy stops being the safer option. That's exactly what happened here. Picture a chain holding something heavy in place, every link depending on the ones next to it. The moment one link decides it would rather survive than hold, the whole chain gives way, and everything it was holding comes crashing down at once. That witness was a link nobody thought to reinforce, because your enemies were so confident nobody would ever get close enough to test it. Once that witness started talking, they didn't just confirm what the money trail already suggested. They filled in the gaps investigators couldn't reach through paperwork alone. The meeting where the number was agreed on, the exact words used to describe what they needed the judge to do. The reassurances passed around the table that nobody would ever find out, spoken with the kind of confidence people only have right before everything falls apart. You never met this witness, chosen one. You had no idea their conscience or their fear, or maybe a mix of both, was quietly becoming the final nail in a case your enemies thought was airtight. But that's how these things work. The people who build a conspiracy rarely account for the fact that everyone inside it is human, and humans crack under pressure in ways money can't always prevent. You might wonder what finally pushed that witness to talk, chosen one, after staying quiet for so long. Sometimes it isn't a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it's the slow accumulation of sleepless nights, the weight of knowing exactly what happened while watching an innocent person carry the consequences of it. Whatever tipped the scale for them, the result was the same. A conspiracy that depended entirely on silence lost the one thing it needed most to survive, and once that silence broke, there was no piecing it back together again. Number 9. The moment the gavel turned on the judge. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when the person everyone trusted to deliver justice becomes the one standing accused of destroying it. That silence happened the day the evidence against the judge became undeniable, chosen one, and everyone in that building felt the ground shift beneath a system they'd assumed was solid. He'd sat behind that bench for years, banging a gavel that was supposed to represent fairness, wearing a robe that was supposed to mean something. And in one single hearing, all of that symbolism collapsed into what it actually was underneath. A costume worn by a man willing to sell someone else's freedom for a number written on a sticky note. Picture a king discovering, in front of his entire court, that the crown he's worn for years was stolen, and that everyone watching finally knows it. That's the weight that landed on him the moment the evidence was presented. Not just exposure, but a complete unraveling of every ounce of authority he'd built his identity around. The same gavel he used to end your freedom was still sitting on his desk when investigators came for him. The same robe he wore to sign away your future was still hanging in his chambers, and the same system he thought he'd successfully bent in your enemy's favor turned out to be the exact system that documented every step of his corruption in painstaking, undeniable detail. You weren't in the room when it happened, chosen one, but somewhere, in that same building where your future had once been decided by a bribe, the truth walked in and did what truth eventually always does. It didn't ask permission. It didn't negotiate. It simply arrived, and once it arrived, there was no version of events left where he kept the robe, kept the bench, or kept his freedom. Think about every person who had ever stood in front of that man, chosen one, trusting that the robe meant what it was supposed to mean. Every one of those cases suddenly needed a second look. Every ruling he ever made became a question mark instead of a settled fact. That's the real cost of what he did, far beyond your case alone. He didn't just fail you. He poisoned the trust an entire community was supposed to be able to place in the system meant to protect them, and the moment that became clear, there was no version of his career that survived it. Number 10. Why the cage they built became their own. There's a certain kind of justice, chosen one, that only the universe seems capable of designing. The kind where the exact trap someone builds for you becomes the trap they eventually fall into themselves. They built a legal cage meant to hold you for years. They studied the system, exploited its weak points, and constructed something they believed was airtight. What they never accounted for is that a cage built on corruption doesn't discriminate about who ends up locked inside it once the truth gets loose. Think about it. Every piece of leverage they used against you, the fabricated case, the bribed judge, the fake paper trail, became evidence once the investigation flipped. The very tools they built to imprison you were the same tools that ended up imprisoning them. They didn't just fail to trap you. They handed investigators a blueprint of their own crime, wrapped up and labeled, sitting there waiting to be used against the people who built it. Picture a hunter who digs a pit trap so deep and so well hidden that he forgets exactly where he placed it, then wanders back through the same field months later, distracted, confident, and falls straight through his own construction. That's what happened here. They were so focused on making sure you fell that they never imagined the ground shifting under their own feet. The charges that were meant to define your future ended up defining theirs instead. Obstruction, bribery, conspiracy to deprive someone of a fair trial. Words that were supposed to appear next to your name on a court document ended up attached to theirs, in the same courthouse, under the same system they thought they'd successfully corrupted for their own benefit. You didn't build this reversal, chosen one. You didn't have to. The universe has a specific way of letting people finish digging before it lets the ground give way, and this was exactly that. The cage they built with such careful, calculated cruelty simply closed around the wrong people in the end. You might ask why this feels like more than simple justice, chosen one, why it lands like something closer to poetry. Because it is closer to poetry. There's a specific kind of balance that only shows up when people who tried to control an outcome through dishonesty end up controlled by the exact consequences they thought they'd outsmarted. They didn't get unlucky, they got matched, measure for measure, by a system finally functioning the way it was always supposed to function, and no amount of money changes that once it starts moving in that direction. Number 11. The robe that came off for the last time. There's a particular image that stays with people long after a scandal like this breaks, chosen one, and it's the image of a judge removing his robe for the final time, not at the end of a long, respected career, but in disgrace, escorted out of a building he once ruled, from behind a bench built on borrowed authority. That image became real the day the truth caught up to him. He didn't get to choose how it ended. There was no quiet resignation, no dignified exit, no chance to control the narrative the way he'd controlled so many verdicts before. Investigators arrived with a warrant, not a request. Reporters arrived with cameras, not appointments. And the robe that had hung in his chambers for years came off that day under circumstances no amount of money could soften. Picture an actor who's played the same powerful role for decades, suddenly having the curtain ripped away mid-performance, exposed in front of an audience that finally sees the truth behind the costume. That's exactly what happened to him. All those years of authority, all that borrowed respect, gone in the time it takes to read a set of charges out loud. The same hands that signed your unjust sentence were the hands placed behind his back that day. The same voice that once delivered verdicts with total confidence was the voice that stayed silent when investigators asked him to explain the transfers. And the same system he thought he'd successfully manipulated became the system that stripped him of everything he'd built his identity around. You never got to witness that moment directly, chosen one, but somewhere, in the very building where injustice was once handed down in your name, the truth finally reversed the roles completely. The man who wore the robe to take your freedom lost his own the moment the evidence became undeniable, and there was nothing left of his authority once that robe came off for the last time. Somewhere in that building, chosen one, there were people who had worked alongside him for years, people who now had to reconcile the version of him they thought they knew with the version the evidence revealed. That's the quiet damage corruption like this leaves behind. It doesn't just cost the person who committed it, it costs every relationship built on the assumption that the robe meant something real. And once that assumption breaks, it doesn't come back easily, not for him, and not for the reputation he spent decades constructing. Number 12. Why your enemies are now cellmates with the man they bought. This is the part that should sit with you the longest, chosen one, because it's the part that proves the universe has a sense of irony sharper than anything a courtroom could ever script on purpose. The people who paid to have you locked away are now locked away themselves, and not in some separate wing far removed from the man they paid. Close enough that they see him every single day, a permanent reminder of exactly how badly their plan collapsed. Think about what that actually means. The judge they bought to guarantee your silence is now a man they can't avoid, a walking symbol of the exact crime that put all of them there in the first place. Every time they see him in that hallway, they're forced to remember the envelope, the meeting, the confidence they had that none of this would ever come back on them. There's no escaping that reminder now. There's no version of their new reality where they get to forget what they did. Picture a group of people who built an elaborate scheme together, confident it would never be traced back to any of them individually, only to end up sharing the exact same fate, side by side, unable to distance themselves from each other even if they wanted to. That's exactly what happened here. The conspiracy that was supposed to separate your fate from theirs instead bound their fates together permanently. You didn't ask for this outcome, chosen one. You didn't design it, orchestrate it, or even know it was happening while it unfolded. But there's something undeniably fitting about the fact that the people who tried to buy your future are now living inside the exact kind of confinement they tried to force onto you. Surrounded by the same walls, the same routines, the same loss of freedom they thought they were only ever going to inflict, never experience. You might wonder if they've said anything to each other since all of this happened, chosen one, whether the loyalty that held their conspiracy together on the outside survives now that they're all living the consequences of it together. It rarely does. People who bond over shared corruption tend to turn on each other the moment survival is on the line. Each one looking for the smallest advantage, the shortest sentence, the first chance to blame somebody else for a plan they all agreed to. The unity they had while plotting against you was never real loyalty. It was convenience, and convenience doesn't hold up once the walls close in for good. Number 13. The verdict nobody saw coming. Every trial has a moment where the outcome finally becomes real, chosen one, and yours came the day the charges against you were formally dropped, reversed, wiped clean from a record that should have never carried them in the first place. That moment doesn't erase what you went through, but it does something almost as powerful. It puts the truth on paper, permanently, in the exact system that was once weaponized against you. Picture the room that day, the same courthouse. Different energy entirely. No bribed judge behind the bench this time. No fabricated case dressed up to look convincing. Just the plain, undeniable truth being read into the record by people who had no reason left to hide it. Your name cleared. Their names attached to charges that will follow them for the rest of their lives. The people who once sat confident, watching the plan they paid for unfold exactly as intended, were nowhere near that confident anymore. They watched the same system they thought they'd successfully corrupted deliver a verdict none of their money could touch this time, because this time the evidence was real, the witnesses were credible, and the person overseeing it all had far more integrity than the man they'd originally bought. You might still be carrying the weight of everything that happened before this moment, chosen one, and that's completely understandable. Nobody walks through something like this and comes out untouched. But carry this truth alongside it. The verdict that was supposed to end your story instead became the beginning of theirs, unraveling completely, in public, permanently, with no bribe left large enough to buy back what they lost. Somewhere out there, chosen one, someone else is sitting exactly where you sat, watching a system that seems stacked against them, wondering if the truth ever actually wins. Your story, once it becomes public record, becomes their proof that it can. That's a weight you never asked to carry, but it's one worth carrying anyway, because every case like yours that ends in a real, documented, undeniable reversal makes the next attempt at this kind of corruption a little harder to pull off. You didn't just get your name cleared, you made the whole scheme more dangerous for anyone foolish enough to try it again. Number 14. Why this is just the beginning of what they can't undo. Here's where we land, chosen one, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we close this out. What happened to you was never just about one case, one judge, or one group of people who thought money could buy your entire future. It was about a system getting tested at its weakest point, and, eventually, holding, not because it's perfect, but because somewhere along the way, somebody with enough power decided your story mattered enough to fight for. They thought buying a verdict would be the end of the conversation. Instead, it became the opening chapter of an investigation that's still unfolding, still uncovering, still connecting names and dates and transfers that reach further than anyone initially expected. Corruption like this rarely stays contained to one case, one judge, one bribe. Once investigators start pulling, they tend to find more than they were originally looking for. Picture a single loose thread on an old sweater. Pull it once, and maybe nothing happens. Pull it with enough force, with enough patience, and eventually the whole thing unravels in ways nobody could have predicted from that first small tug. That's exactly where this story is heading now. What started as one bribe, one judge, one attempt to erase you, is turning into something far bigger than the people who started it ever imagined it could become. You don't have to do anything else, chosen one. You already did the hardest part. You stayed calm when they needed you to break. You stayed steady when the system was stacked against you. You let the truth do what truth eventually always does. Arrive late, but arrive completely, undeniably, permanently. Number 15. Why the truth was never actually stoppable in the first place. Here's the thing they never understood about what they were trying to do, chosen one. You cannot actually buy the truth. You can delay it. You can bury it under paperwork and bribes, and a system temporarily bent in your favor. But truth doesn't expire, and it doesn't forget, and it doesn't care how much money changed hands trying to convince it otherwise. It waits, patiently, quietly, sometimes for longer than anyone watching from the outside thinks is fair, and then it arrives exactly when it's needed most, carrying everything it collected while it waited. They spent real money trying to purchase an outcome that was never actually for sale. That's the miscalculation underneath every other miscalculation in this entire story. They thought a verdict was the same thing as the truth, that if they controlled the paperwork, they controlled reality itself. But a signed piece of paper was never going to change what actually happened. Chosen one. And the moment someone with real power decided to look past the paperwork and into the reality underneath it, their entire plan was already finished. They just didn't know it yet. Picture a dam holding back a river that's been rising for longer than anyone building the dam wanted to admit. They can reinforce it, add another layer of concrete, tell themselves it will hold forever. But rivers don't stop rising just because somebody built something in their way, and eventually, every dam built on denial instead of truth gives way to the water it was never actually strong enough to hold. That's what happened here. The dam was the bribe. The river was the truth. And rivers always win eventually. You spent time in a system that briefly failed you, chosen one. And there's no version of this story where that doesn't matter, where it doesn't leave something behind that takes real time to heal from. Nobody's asking you to pretend it didn't happen or that it didn't cost you something. What this story is asking you to hold on to instead is the proof, permanent and undeniable now, that the system correcting itself wasn't an accident. It happened because the truth about you was strong enough to survive every attempt to erase it, and because somewhere, somebody with the power to act on that truth chose to use it. They thought they were untouchable because they'd never been caught before. Every person who has ever believed that has eventually learned the same lesson, usually in the exact building where they thought their control was strongest. The courtroom that was supposed to bury you became the courtroom that buried them instead. And there is no bribe large enough, no envelope thick enough to buy that outcome back. They bribed a judge to erase you. Instead, they wrote the first page of their own downfall, and it's still being written. If this story meant something to you, if it landed somewhere real, drop that 77 one more time, hit like, subscribe, and share it with the next person who needs to know that the truth always finds its way back to the surface eventually. Thank you for being part of this journey, chosen one. We'll see you in the next one. Take care, and goodbye.